I was standing in my driveway when Patricia Monroe pulled up in her pristine white Mercedes, and I knew immediately that my peaceful Tuesday afternoon was about to go straight to hell. My name is Victor Xander, and I had been living on my 5-acre property just outside of Meadowbrook, New York for about 3 years at that point. The property came with an old barn that had been there since the 1940s, weathered gray wood that told stories of decades past. I loved that barn. It had character, history, and it was mine. I used it to store my woodworking equipment and the vintage motorcycle I was restoring. Patricia stepped out of her car wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and she carried a leather folder under her arm like it was a weapon. "Mr. Xander," she said, her voice dripping with fake pleasantness. "I hope I am not catching you at a bad time." I wiped the sawdust off my hands with a rag. "What can I do for you, Patricia?" She opened her folder and pulled out several photographs. They were pictures of my barn, taken from different angles. As president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, I am afraid I need to discuss a rather serious violation with you. I felt my jaw tighten. "What violation?" "Your barn is in direct violation of Section 7, subsection 3 of our community guidelines. All structures visible from the street must be painted in approved colors and maintained to community standards. This weathered appearance is simply unacceptable." I looked past her at my barn, sitting a good 100 feet back from the road. "That barn has been there since before this neighborhood even existed. I bought the property with the barn already on it." Patricia smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Be that as it may, you signed the HOA agreement when you purchased your home. The barn must be painted within 30 days, or you will face daily fines of $100 until compliance is achieved." $100 a day. I could not believe what I was hearing. "For a barn that is not bothering anyone." The HOA board voted unanimously on this matter. "Here is your official notice." She handed me a letter on official HOA letterhead. "The approved colors are listed on page 2. I personally recommend colonial blue or barn red. Something that adds to our community's aesthetic appeal." I scanned the letter, my anger building with every word. "This is ridiculous. That barn is historic. Painting it would actually decrease its value and authenticity. Perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing property within an HOA community, Mr. Xander." Patricia closed her folder with a sharp snap. 30 days. The clock starts today." She got back in her Mercedes and drove away, leaving me standing there with a letter that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and read through every page of the HOA documents I had signed 3 years ago. My real estate agent had rushed me through the closing, and I had been so excited about the property that I had not paid much attention to the fine print. Now, I was paying the price for that mistake. The HOA rules were extensive and detailed. They covered everything from lawn height to acceptable decorative items to structural appearances. There it was, buried in Section 7, subsection 3, exactly what Patricia had quoted. All structures must conform to community aesthetic standards and be painted in approved colors. I pulled up my property survey on my computer and studied it carefully. My 5 acres sat at the edge of the development. When Meadowbrook Estates had been built 12 years ago, they had incorporated several older properties into the planned community. Mine was one of them. The original farmhouse had been torn down and replaced with my current home, but the barn had been left standing because it sat far enough back from the main construction area. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Derek, who was a real estate attorney in Albany. After explaining the situation, I asked him what my options were. "Well, you signed the HOA agreement," Derek said. "Legally, they have the right to enforce their rules, but there might be a loophole. What is the barn actually sitting on? I mean, what is that land zoned as?" "I do not know," I admitted. "Residential, I assume." "Do not assume. Check with the county zoning office tomorrow. If that barn is on land that predates the HOA, there might be something you can do. Call me after you find out." The next morning, I drove to the Dutchess County office building in Poughkeepsie. The zoning office was on the third floor, a maze of cubicles and filing cabinets that looked like they had not been updated since the 1980s. A woman named Margaret helped me at the counter. She was probably in her 60s, with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "What can I help you with today?" I explained my situation and gave her my property address. She typed it into her computer, frowned, and then disappeared into the back room. She returned 15 minutes later with a dusty folder and several large maps. "This is interesting," she said, spreading one of the maps across the counter. "Your property has split zoning. The front 3 acres where your house sits is zoned residential and falls under the HOA jurisdiction. But the back 2 acres, including the area where your barn sits, is still zoned agricultural. It looks like it was never rezoned when the development went in." My heart started racing. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that portion of your property is not subject to the same regulations as residential land. Agricultural zoning has different rules, different regulations. Your HOA agreement would only apply to the residential portion. So they cannot force me to paint my barn." Margaret adjusted her glasses and studied the documents more carefully. "I am not a lawyer, so I cannot give you legal advice. But based on these records, your barn sits entirely on agriculturally zoned land. You would need to verify this with a surveyor and probably an attorney." I left the office with copies of everything Margaret had given me and immediately called Derek. He was just as excited as I was when I explained what I had found. "This is good, Victor. Really good. But we need to make sure everything is documented properly. I am going to connect you with a surveyor I trust, and we need to get exact measurements of your property lines in relation to the zoning boundaries." 2 days later, a surveyor named Bill Thompson spent 4 hours on my property with his equipment, measuring and marking. When he finished, he showed me a detailed map that confirmed what the county office had indicated. The barn sat entirely on the agricultural portion of my land, a full 20 feet inside the agricultural zone. "It is clear as day," Bill said, pointing to his measurements. "This barn is not in the residential zone. Never has been." I took all the documentation to Derek's office in Albany. He spent 2 hours reviewing everything, making notes and cross-referencing with various regulations and laws. "Here is the situation," he finally said. "Your barn is on agricultural land, which means the HOA technically has no authority over it. However, they are going to fight this. Patricia Monroe and her board are not going to back down just because you show them a zoning map. We need to be prepared for this to get messy." "How messy?" "They will probably try to fine you anyway. Then they might put a lien on your property. Eventually, they could try to foreclose. But if we have our documentation in order, we can fight them at every step." I left Derek's office with a strategy. The next day, I sent a certified letter to Patricia Monroe and the HOA board. In it, I included copies of the zoning maps, the survey results, and a letter from Derek explaining that the barn was not subject to HOA jurisdiction due to its location on agriculturally zoned land. I requested that they withdraw their violation notice immediately. Patricia showed up at my house 3 days later, and this time she was not alone. She had brought 2 other board members with her. A man named Gregory Vaughn, who owned a car dealership in town, and a woman named Candace Peterson, who I had seen around the neighborhood but never spoken to. "Mr. Xander," Patricia said, her voice sharp and cold. "We received your letter, and the board finds your interpretation of the zoning laws to be incorrect and irrelevant. You signed an HOA agreement that covers your entire property. The barn must be painted. I had been expecting this. The zoning laws are not up for interpretation. My barn sits on agricultural land. The county confirmed it. A licensed surveyor confirmed it. My attorney confirmed it. You have no authority over that portion of my property." Gregory stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Now you listen here. We are not going to let one homeowner think they can just ignore the rules because they found some technicality. This sets a bad precedent for the entire community." "It is not a technicality," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It is the law." Candace, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Why are you being so difficult about this? Just paint the barn. It is not that big of a deal. The HOA will even approve a loan program to help with the costs. Because it is my property, and I should not have to paint a historic barn just because Patricia thinks it does not look pretty enough. The barn is not violating any actual laws. It is not a hazard. It is just old, and there is nothing wrong with that." Patricia's face had gone red. "The fine starts accruing tomorrow, Mr. Xander, $100 per day. I suggest you reconsider your position." They left, and I immediately called Derek. They are not backing down. I did not think they would. Let them start the fines. Do not pay them. We will let this play out and take them to court if we have to. The first fine notice arrived in my mailbox a week later. $100 for 1 day of non-compliance. The next week, another notice for $700. The week after that, $1,400. They were adding up fast. I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm out of White Plains, demanding payment of the accumulated fines plus late fees and administrative costs. The total was already over $3,000. I forwarded everything to Derek. "They are going to put a lien on your property," Derek warned me. "That is their next step. But do not worry. We are building a strong case. I have been researching precedents, and there are several cases in New York where HOAs have overstepped their boundaries regarding zoning issues. We can beat this." While waiting for the legal process to unfold, I decided to take things a step further. If my barn was on agricultural land, then I was going to use it for agricultural purposes. That would strengthen my position and make it even harder for the HOA to claim jurisdiction. I called up an old friend from college named Marcus, who ran a small, organic farm in Rhinebeck. "I need some advice about starting a small agricultural operation," I told him. Marcus came out to my property the next weekend. We walked around the 2 acres of agricultural land, and he nodded thoughtfully. "You have got good soil here. What are you thinking? Vegetables, flowers, livestock? What would be easiest but still qualify as legitimate agricultural use?" "Chickens," he said immediately. "Get yourself a dozen laying hens. Sell the eggs at the farmer's market or just to neighbors. It is legitimate agriculture, low maintenance, and actually profitable if you do it right." 2 weeks later, I had a new chicken coop set up behind the barn, and 12 beautiful hens had taken up residence. I registered my operation with the county as Xander Family Farm, got my agricultural exemption paperwork in order, and started collecting eggs. The chickens were actually great. They had personality. They kept the bugs down in my yard, and the eggs were incredible. I found myself enjoying the morning routine of feeding them and collecting eggs. Several of my neighbors, ones who were not on the HOA board, started buying eggs from me. Word spread, and soon I had a regular customer base. Patricia found out about the chickens 3 weeks after I got them. She showed up at my door at 8 in the morning on a Saturday, practically vibrating with rage. "You have chickens," she said, her voice shaking. "You have livestock in a residential neighborhood." "I have chickens on agriculturally zoned land," I corrected her, "which is completely legal. In fact, I am now operating a registered agricultural business. Would you like to buy some eggs? They are $5 a dozen, and they are the best eggs you will ever taste." This is outrageous. I am calling the county. I am calling the health department. This is a violation of so many regulations. Call whoever you want. Everything is legal and properly documented. I have all my permits and licenses. She did call. The county sent an inspector out 2 days later, a friendly guy named Tom who checked my setup, reviewed my paperwork, and gave me a perfect score. "Everything looks great, Mr. Xander. Your coop is actually nicer than most I see. Keep up the good work." The health department came the following week. Another inspection, another pass. The woman who inspected my operation even bought 2 dozen eggs before she left. Every inspection, every approval, every piece of official documentation strengthened my legal position. Derek was building an airtight case. The HOA's fines kept accumulating. On paper, I now owed them over $12,000. They filed a lien against my property, just as Derek had predicted. We filed a counterclaim, arguing that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the agricultural portion of my land, and that their fines were therefore invalid and constituted harassment. The case was scheduled for a hearing in county court. Judge Martha Friedman would be presiding. According to Derek, she was fair but no nonsense, and she did not like it when people wasted her time. The week before the hearing, I was in my barn working on my motorcycle when I heard someone calling my name. I walked outside to find a woman I did not recognize standing near the chicken coop. She was probably in her early 30s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. "Victor Xander?" she asked. "That is me. I am Zelda Osborne. I am a reporter with the Poughkeepsie Journal. I heard about your situation with the HOA, and I was wondering if I could interview you for a story I am working on." I hesitated. "How did you hear about it? Court filings are public record. Plus, one of your neighbors mentioned it to me." This is exactly the kind of local interest story our readers love. David versus Goliath, small property owner against overbearing HOA. It is compelling stuff. I invited Zelda inside, and we talked for over an hour. I showed her all my documentation, explained the zoning situation, and walked her through the timeline of events. She took notes and photos, including several of the barn and the chickens. "This is great material," she said. "I will have the story ready to run this weekend. Just so you know, I am going to reach out to Patricia Monroe and the HOA board for comment." "Good luck with that. Patricia is not the easiest person to talk to," Zelda grinned. "I have dealt with worse." The story ran that Sunday on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "Local man fights HOA over historic barn, starts farm to prove point." It was well written and fair, presenting both sides of the issue but making it clear that the legal complications favored my position. The article included a quote from Patricia that made me laugh out loud. "Mr. Xander is trying to turn our beautiful residential community into a farmyard. This is not what homeowners signed up for when they invested in Meadowbrook Estates." The story got picked up by a few other regional papers and even made it onto a local news website. My email inbox filled up with messages from people offering support, sharing their own HOA horror stories, and asking where they could buy my eggs. The publicity put additional pressure on the HOA. Several homeowners in the development reached out to me privately, saying they were glad someone was finally standing up to Patricia and her heavy-handed board. A few mentioned that they had been fined for minor violations in the past and had paid up rather than fight, but now they were reconsidering. The day before the hearing, Derek came out to my property to go over our strategy one final time. We sat at my kitchen table with all the documents spread out before us. "Tomorrow is going to be straightforward," he said. "We present the zoning documentation, the survey results, and the registration of your agricultural operation. The law is on our side. Unless the judge decides to completely ignore precedent and regulation, which is unlikely, we should win this. What happens after we win? The lien gets removed from your property. The fines are invalidated. The HOA will be ordered to stop harassing you about the barn. You go back to living your life. And Patricia," Derek smiled, "Patricia will have to explain to her homeowners why the HOA just lost a lawsuit and probably racked up significant legal fees in the process. That is not a conversation she is going to enjoy." The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning at the Dutchess County Courthouse in Poughkeepsie. I put on my best suit, something I had not worn since my cousin's wedding 2 years ago, and met Derek in the courthouse lobby. Patricia was already there with the HOA's attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s named Jennifer Walsh. Gregory and Candace were there as well, sitting on a bench looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes. We were called into the courtroom at exactly 10. Judge Friedman was a woman in her late 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the case files briefly and then looked up at us. "This is a dispute between a homeowner and his HOA regarding enforcement of community guidelines on a barn structure. Is that correct?" she asked. "Yes, Your Honor," both Derek and Jennifer Walsh said in unison. "Very well. Miss Walsh, you represent the HOA. Please present your position." Jennifer Walsh stood and launched into her argument. She emphasized that I had signed the HOA agreement, that the agreement clearly stated all structures on my property must conform to community standards, and that I was in willful violation of those standards. She argued that allowing me to ignore the HOA rules would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the entire purpose of the Homeowners Association. "Mr. Xander's barn is visible from the street and detracts from the community's aesthetic appeal," she said. "Multiple neighbors have complained about its appearance. The HOA has a duty to maintain property values and community standards. That is what homeowners pay their dues for." Judge Friedman listened without expression. When Jennifer Walsh finished, the judge turned to Derek. "Mr. Lewis, your turn." Derek stood and presented our case with calm precision. He walked the judge through the zoning maps, showing clearly where the residential zone ended and the agricultural zone began. He presented the survey results that proved the barn sat entirely within the agricultural zone. He showed the registration documents for my farming operation and the various permits and inspections I had passed. "Your Honor, the law is clear on this matter," Derek said. "An HOA's authority is limited to property that falls within its jurisdiction. Mr. Xander's barn sits on land that is zoned agricultural and has never been rezoned residential. The HOA agreement he signed covers his residential property, but it does not and cannot extend to property that is legally designated for agricultural use. The HOA is attempting to exert authority where none exists." Judge Friedman asked several questions, which Derek answered thoroughly. She then asked Jennifer Walsh if she wanted to respond. "Your Honor, the spirit of the HOA agreement covers the entire property," Jennifer argued. "Mr. Xander is using a technicality to avoid his obligations to his community." "Miss," Walsh, zoning laws are not technicalities, Judge Friedman said, her tone sharp. They are legal designations that carry significant weight. Do you have any precedent that shows an HOA can enforce rules on land that is zoned for purposes outside their jurisdiction? Jennifer shuffled through her papers. We believe the HOA agreement supersedes the zoning designation in this case. Based on what legal principle? Based on the contract Mr. Xander signed when he purchased his property. Judge Friedman looked at the documents in front of her for a long moment. The courtroom was completely silent except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. I am prepared to rule, the judge finally said. The evidence is clear that the barn in question sits on land that is zoned agricultural. The county has confirmed this designation. A licensed surveyor has confirmed the property boundaries. Mr. Xander has registered a legitimate agricultural operation on said land and has obtained all necessary permits and passed all required inspections. She looked directly at Jennifer Walsh. An HOA agreement cannot supersede zoning law, Miss Walsh. The HOA's jurisdiction extends only to property that falls within their designated residential area. I am ruling in favor of Mr. Xander. The lien placed on his property is to be removed immediately. All fines are invalidated and no further fines may be assessed regarding this barn. The HOA is ordered to cease any and all harassment of Mr. Xander regarding structures located on the agricultural portion of his property. I felt Derek squeeze my shoulder. We had won. Judge Friedman was not finished. Furthermore, I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Xander's legal fees, which appear to be reasonable given the circumstances. The HOA brought this action despite clear evidence that they lacked jurisdiction. That was poor judgment. Patricia made a small sound from her seat behind Jennifer Walsh. It might have been a gasp or a suppressed cry. I did not turn around to look. Miss Walsh, I suggest the HOA board you represent take this as a learning experience, Judge Friedman continued. Homeowners associations serve an important purpose, but they are not above the law and their authority is not unlimited. This case should never have ended up in my courtroom. It should have been resolved the moment Mr. Xander presented his zoning documentation. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor, Jennifer Walsh said quietly. The hearing was over. Derek and I stepped out into the hallway and he was grinning from ear to ear. That went even better than I hoped. The judge does not usually award legal fees in these cases unless she is really annoyed at one of the parties. Patricia and her board just got handed a very expensive lesson. We walked past Patricia and the other board members on our way out. Patricia would not make eye contact with me. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the past hour. Gregory was red-faced and muttering to Candace, who just looked relieved it was over. The story of the hearing made it into the Poughkeepsie Journal 2 days later. Xander wrote a follow-up piece with the headline "Judge Rules Against HOA in Barn Dispute, Orders Association to Pay Legal Fees." The article quoted Judge Friedman's comments about HOAs not being above the law. The response from the community was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails and messages congratulating me. Several people who lived in other HOA communities reached out to ask for advice on their own disputes. Derek told me he had received 3 new client inquiries from people with HOA problems, but the most significant development came 2 weeks after the hearing. I was working in my barn when I heard a car pull up. I walked outside and was surprised to see a man I did not recognize standing there with a clipboard. "Victor Xander?" he asked. "That is me. I am Robert Chen. I am here to serve you with this petition." He handed me a thick envelope. "Have a good day." He got back in his car and left before I could ask any questions. I opened the envelope and started reading. It was a petition signed by 43 residents of Meadowbrook Estates calling for a special meeting to vote on removing the current HOA board and electing new leadership. I called Derek immediately. "Did you know about this?" "I heard rumors," he admitted. "Apparently, your case was the final straw for a lot of homeowners who have been unhappy with Patricia's leadership for a while. The legal fees from your case are significant, and they are coming out of the HOA's reserve fund, which means everyone's dues are probably going up. People are not happy about that." The special meeting was held 3 weeks later in the community center that sat at the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. I was not sure if I should attend, but several neighbors encouraged me to come. The room was packed. It looked like most of the 200 or so households in the development had sent at least one representative. Patricia sat at the front table with Gregory and Candace, all three of them looking miserable. A homeowner named David Marshall, who had organized the petition, stood up to speak first. "We are here tonight because the current board has lost the confidence of this community. The situation with Mr. Xander and his barn was handled poorly from start to finish. The board pursued an expensive legal action that we had no chance of winning, and now we are all going to pay for that mistake through increased dues and depleted reserves." Several people applauded. Patricia tried to speak, but David held up his hand. "You will have your chance to respond, Patricia. But first, let's hear from some other homeowners." What followed was 90 minutes of homeowners standing up to air grievances about the HOA board. Some complaints were about Patricia's handling of my situation. Others were about different issues entirely. One man talked about being fined $200 because his mailbox post was the wrong shade of white. A woman described being told she could not plant roses in her front yard because they were not on the approved landscaping list. Another homeowner talked about receiving a violation notice because his teenage son had left a basketball hoop in the driveway overnight. The picture that emerged was of an HOA board that had become increasingly authoritarian and petty over the past few years. My situation with the barn had just been the most visible and dramatic example of their overreach. When it was finally Patricia's turn to speak, she stood up slowly. She looked defeated before she even opened her mouth. "I understand that people are upset," she said. The board was trying to maintain the standards that make Meadowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. Yes, we made a mistake with the Xander situation, but everything we have done has been in what we believed was the best interest of the community. "At what cost?" someone shouted from the back. "We are going to have to pay over $20,000 in legal fees because you could not admit you were wrong." Patricia sat down without saying anything else. The vote was held immediately after. By a margin of 162 to 38, the residents voted to remove the current board and hold new elections. 3 weeks later, new board members were elected. David Marshall became the new president. His first official act was to form a committee to review all HOA rules and eliminate ones that were too restrictive or petty. They sent out a survey to all homeowners asking for input on what rules were important and which ones should be changed. I was invited to serve on the committee, but I politely declined. I had spent enough time dealing with HOA politics. I just wanted to live my life, work in my barn, and take care of my chickens. Life settled into a comfortable routine after that. My egg business grew slowly but steadily. I had over 30 regular customers, and on Saturday mornings, I set up a small stand at the Rhinebeck Farmers Market where I sold eggs and talked to people about small-scale farming. I finished restoring my vintage motorcycle, a 1972 Triumph Bonneville that had taken me 2 years to rebuild. The first time I rode it around my property, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning against the HOA and everything to do with completing a project I loved. Marcus came by regularly to check on my chickens and give me advice. He convinced me to expand my operation slightly, and I added 6 more hens and a rooster named General Sherman, who took his duties very seriously. Patricia moved out of Meadowbrook Estates 6 months after the board was dissolved. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband bought a condo in Fishkill, somewhere with no HOA. I never saw her again after the special meeting. Derek and I stayed in touch. He sent me a bottle of excellent bourbon at Christmas with a card that said, "To standing your ground and knowing the law." We got together every few months for dinner, and he never failed to tell anyone who would listen about the case where his client started a farm to beat an HOA. The new HOA board was night and day different from Patricia's regime. They focused on actual community improvements like fixing the entrance landscaping and organizing neighborhood events. The ridiculous rules about mailbox colors and approved plants were eliminated. People were allowed to live their lives without fear of receiving violation notices for trivial matters. My barn remained unpainted, weathered gray wood that told its story to anyone who cared to look. I added a small sign near the road that said, "Xander Family Farm Fresh Eggs Daily," with my phone number. The barn had become something of a landmark in the area, especially after the news coverage. Zelda Osborne did one more follow-up story about a year after the hearing, checking in to see how things had turned out. Her article talked about the positive changes in Meadowbrook Estates and how one homeowner's fight had led to broader reforms. She interviewed several residents who said the community was a much better place to live now that the board focused on actual issues rather than petty enforcement. The article ended with a quote from me. "I never wanted to fight with my HOA. I just wanted to live on my property in peace and preserve a piece of history. Sometimes standing up for what is right means challenging authority, even when it is difficult. I'm glad I did, not just for myself, but for all my neighbors who were tired of being bullied over trivial matters." On a warm Saturday morning in June, about 18 months after the whole thing started, I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee and watching the chickens peck around their run. The barn stood solid and strong in the background, exactly as it should be. General Sherman crowed loudly, announcing the arrival of a new day. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Remember when Patricia said you were turning the neighborhood into a farmyard? How's that working out for you?" I smiled and typed back, "Pretty damn well, actually." A car pulled into my driveway, and I recognized my neighbor Tom Winters and his 2 kids. Tom had been one of the people who supported me from the beginning, even testifying at the special meeting about his own issues with the old board. "Morning, Victor," Tom called out. "Kids wanted to see the chickens, and we need 3 dozen eggs if you have them." "Come on back," I said, standing up. General Sherman loves showing off for visitors. We walked to the coop together, Tom's kids running ahead excitedly. This was what community was supposed to be about. Neighbors helping neighbors, people living their lives without unnecessary interference, and a sense of shared respect for individual property rights. The fight with the HOA had been stressful and expensive, even though I won back my legal fees. There were moments when I wondered if it would have been easier to just paint the barn and move on. But looking at it now, weathered and authentic and exactly as it should be, I knew I had made the right choice. Standing up to Patricia and the old board had not just been about my barn. It had been about drawing a line and saying that property owners have rights that should be respected. It had been about pushing back against the kind of petty authoritarianism that makes people miserable in their own homes. and it had been about preserving something historic and meaningful rather than destroying it for the sake of arbitrary aesthetic standards. The kids were delighted by the chickens, especially General Sherman, who strutted around like he owned the place, which in a sense he did. Tom and I talked about his plans to build a deck in his backyard, something he had been putting off for years because the old board had such a complicated approval process. "New board approved my plans in 1 week," he said. "No hassle, no ridiculous requirements, just a simple review to make sure it meets building codes. This is how it should have always been." After Tom and his family left with their eggs, I spent the afternoon working on a new woodworking project in the barn. I was building a table for my dining room, using reclaimed wood from an old farmhouse that had been torn down in Red Hook. The wood had character and history, just like my barn. As the sun started to set, I stepped outside and leaned against the barn wall. The wood was warm from the day's sunshine, solid and real under my hands. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear kids playing in their yards, free from the worry that some HOA board member would show up with a violation notice because their toys were visible from the street. My phone rang. It was Marcus calling to tell me about a rooster he was retiring who would be perfect for my flock. We talked for a while about chickens, farming, and his plans to expand his operation. Before we hung up, he said something that stuck with me. "You know what I respect most about what you did, Victor? You did not just fight for yourself. You changed an entire community for the better. That barn of yours became a symbol of pushing back against unreasonable authority. That matters." After the call ended, I walked over to the chicken coop to make sure everyone was settling in for the night. General Sherman gave me a look that seemed to ask what took me so long. The hens were already roosting, content and safe. I locked up the coop and headed back to the house as the last light faded from the sky. Tomorrow was Sunday, which meant the farmers' market and interacting with customers who appreciated fresh eggs and good conversation. It was a simple life, but it was mine, lived on my terms on my property. The barn stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, a monument to persistence and the importance of knowing your rights. Patricia Monroe had tried to force me to paint it, to bend to her will and her vision of what the community should look like. Instead, I had found a way to end her authority entirely, not just over my property but over the whole community. It was not revenge exactly. It was something better. It was justice, earned through research and determination and a willingness to stand up for what was right. The old barn had been there since the 1940s, and if I had anything to say about it, it would be there for decades more, weathered and gray and perfect just the way it was. I went inside, made myself dinner and sat down to watch the game. Life was good. The fight was over. I had won, not just in court but in every way that mattered. My property was mine, free from the tyranny of an overreaching HOA board. My neighbors had taken back control of their community, and a historic barn continued to stand, unbothered and authentic. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where everybody wins, except the people who deserve to lose. Patricia and her board had learned an expensive lesson about the limits of their authority. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates had learned they could stand up to bad leadership and create positive change. And I had learned that sometimes fighting back, even when it seems difficult, is absolutely worth it. The next morning, I woke up early as usual and went through my routine. Coffee first, then out to feed the chickens and collect eggs. General Sherman greeted me with his usual crow, demanding breakfast. The hens clucked softly, already busy with the important work of being chickens. I stood there in the early morning light, basket of fresh eggs in hand, and looked at my barn. Patricia Monroe had seen an eyesore that needed to be painted. I saw history, character, and a symbol of independence. We had both been right in our own ways, but only one of us had the law on our side. The fight with the HOA had taught me something important about property rights, community, and the power of knowing the law. It had also taught me about chickens, which turned out to be surprisingly entertaining and rewarding. Most importantly, it had taught me that sometimes the system works if you are willing to do the work to make it work. My phone buzzed with orders for eggs. The weekend rush was starting. I headed inside to wash and carton the eggs, ready for another day of my simple agricultural business on my agricultural land, with my unpainted barn standing proudly in the background, exactly where it belonged.